Melbourne has the dubious honour of being the fastest growing city in Australia. So perhaps local authorities were amongst those hoping a new federal government plan would lead the way on population growth. Brendan Trembath reports.
For Australians coping with worsening traffic and suburban sprawl, the projection that Australia's population would nearly double by the middle of the century was not what they wanted to hear.
I actually believe in a big Australia.
But then came a new Prime Minister and an election campaign fought on the urban fringes of the big capital cities, where squeezing in more people was not a popular option.
Let's take a breath and get it right. Let's not make as our national goal the goal of a big Australia. Let's make our national goal a sustainable Australia.
What that sustainable Australia would be was left to a new minister and a new national population strategy. Today, Tony Burke headed to the epicentre of Australia's urban growth, Queensland's Gold Coast, to outline what that strategy would be.
Once we get to the core of the economic drivers and making sure that we've got issues of infrastructure being able to be taken into account, and acknowledging that so much of the environmental footprint isn't about our total number, but it's about where we live and how we live.
The Minister is determined to avoid any population target or cap.
Sustainable Australia, sustainable communities. The right way to deal with population policy is not through an arbitrary and ultimately senseless debate about total numbers.
A cynical exercise in cutting and pasting previous government announcements and putting them in a glossy document does not amount to a sustainable population strategy. I mean, seriously, the Women's Weekly's royal wedding coverage, I think, only exceeds this document in terms of its commitment to glossy photos. 10% of the document is literally glossy full-page photos.
While the shadow immigration minister accuses the government of being light on detail, he doesn't want to commit to a population target either.
Coalition's very prepared to support policies that ensures a greater spread of the population and supports regional areas. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that that happens overnight, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that that absolves a government from the responsibility of seeking to manage things that were within its control, which is obviously the migration program.
The typical Australian are going to have less because there's the same size cake with more people sharing it, everyone gets less.
The philanthropist and entrepreneur Dick Smith made his first fortune selling consumer electronics. He rode waves of economic growth. Now he wants to get off.
I've benefited from the growthy economy without any doubt more than most people, but I've come to realise that it's going to destroy Australia and the world for our children and grandchildren.
Dick Smith does have a population target in mind, and he says where Australia is headed is unsustainable.
It's been claimed that we're going to go to 36 million or so. Wayne Goff says it's inevitable. Well, over my dead body, because I can tell you the quality of life for people then will be an absolute disaster. It's nothing but a downside now to go to more and more people in Australia, indeed to go to more and more people in the world.
The demographer Peter MacDonald from the Australian National University says the government's decision to avoid long-term targets is sound, but he says it could have tried to look a few years ahead.
I think it might have focused on population growth in the next decade at least, to be more specific about that, because I think in the next decade it's pretty clear that migration is going to remain relatively high. If we're going to have 250,000 new jobs in Australia each year, and the domestic labour supply will at best produce about 100,000 of those.
Professor MacDonald says the real driver of population growth is not government policy, but the state of the economy.
Throughout Australian history, migration has been driven by labour demand in Australia. And there are periods in Australia, and sometimes long periods in Australia, where migration was close to zero because there was very little labour demand in Australia, so, say in the 1930s, but also in mid-1970s, early 1990s. But we're now in a period of very strong labour demand, and we can expect lots of migration as a result of that.
The Minister says even short-term predictions are difficult to make.
If you were to set targets 5 years ago, It would have been done without knowing anything that we're about to have a global financial crisis, nor understanding the implications of mining boom Mark II, where the dollar would end up, where our terms of trade would go.
Or whether the Australia of the future will need to be that big.
We'll be back next Friday. See you then.